Topic for this January presentation was winter tree ID, and we're going to do some fun facts too, right? This is winter. We got our feet up. We're trying to survive inside mostly. So let's have fun with this. Let's remember better days and think about better days, but let's also remember all the cool things that trees do and that are about on trees. There's some fun stuff when you stop and think about it. So, first up, let's do a few fun facts. Are you smarter than a fifth grader is what I often like to say when I'm doing these things. We won't ask them in terms of questions. We'll just make statements here. And we'll start with this, that I'm always fascinated by big trees. And the tallest tree in the world is a 380-foot coast redwood in Northern California. It's called Hyperion. It's in those northern redwood forests in Northern California. And it's interesting to me that our Nebraska state capitol is just about as tall as the tallest trees in the world. That just seems pretty cool to me. There's another big tree in California called the General Sherman. And Randy Crawford, I think you're on the webinar today. You shared with me this picture. So that's you, Randy, out there in the sequoias in the Sierra Nevada mountains, right? Can you unmute and say anything about that? Are you? And maybe I have everybody muted. Let me see if I can. Anyhow, that's Randy Crawford. The General Sherman is a giant sequoia. It's not the tallest tree in the world, but it's the largest tree by volume. That's pretty fascinating. I was fortunate to be able to get out to California this last summer in September, and I got to poke around the redwoods, the Muir Woods just north of San Francisco, and then up a little further north in another state park. And they are truly amazing uh, things, living organisms to see. I was so glad I could be a part of that. I'm also fortunate that I get to visit the Great Smoky Mountains National Park every so often. My wife and I are headed there, actually leaving tomorrow for a week. We have a cabin out there in the Pigeon Forge area. And when we go, even this time of year, I love to traipse around the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. There are some absolutely massive, big old trees in there. And some of the biggest are these tulip trees that can be up to 30 feet in circumference or more and up to 150 feet tall. So the Great Smoky Mountains is a great place to visit. And I got to tell you, folks, if you ever want to get out there, I know a guy who has a cabin and he'd be glad to give you a good rental price on that thing. You're only 10 miles from the Great Smoky National Park, also Dollywood and Pigeon Forge and all the fun things to do about it. I apologize for this advertisement in the middle of all of this, but we want to share our wonderful cabin with anybody who wants to be out there. And even on our property, we have 40 species of trees and shrubs growing on that 2 acres that you'll have fun to poke around in. Nebraska doesn't have 150-foot tall trees, anything like that in the redwoods for sure, but we do have some big trees, and our biggest trees generally top out at a little over 100 feet tall. And so, for example, we have a pin oak here in Lincoln that's right around 110 feet tall. Then we have a 100 foot tall pecan down in Brownville, a real massive tree. The other picture here is a ponderosa pine, our state champion ponderosa pine, out in the Gilbert Baker Wildlife Management Zone northwest of Harrison. That tree is also almost 110 feet tall, and there are some really fantastic ponderosa pines if you ever have a chance to get out and poke around that part of the world. We can also be proud of a great big tree here in Nebraska, the national champion Eastern Cottonwood. That's the state tree of Nebraska. And we found the national champion, actually, Dana Genero, the person in this picture here, uh, is the one who nominated it a couple years ago. That's an Eastern Cottonwood. It's 85 feet tall and a spread of 120 feet wide, but it has a trunk circumference of 37.2 feet. So if you think about that, that's going to take 6 adults trying to hold hands around that tree to reach around it. That's a big tree. We measure a lot of big cottonwoods in our state, and there are several in our database that are over 30 feet in circumference. They're just fantastic trees. What about old trees? There's a Great Basin bristlecone pine in the White Mountains of California that's thought to be the world's oldest non-clonal tree with a single trunk, just under 5,000 years old. They formerly listed a tree out there at 5,062, but that went away last year. So now the oldest tree is either that bristlecone pine out in California or possibly a Patagonian cypress in Chile, which is thought to be 5,400 years old. They haven't gotten a precise measurement on that yet, but it might be coming. So that tree is also just a fantastic old, big old tree in Chile. In Nebraska, we do have some old trees ourselves, and this is always fascinating to me that our oldest trees are actually out in western Nebraska where it's hardest to be a tree. But there are Rocky Mountain junipers out in the Wildcat Hills south of Scotts Bluff and Gearing that are over 800 years old. That just seems to defy common sense to me. How does a tree, they've lived through some droughts that you and I couldn't even imagine now, 20 to 30-year-old droughts. So and not too far from there in the South Panhandle, right on the border with Wyoming in Kimball County, is a stand of limber pines stranded from the last ice age retreat of the pines that used to be more thick in our part of the world. Most of the limber pines retreated to the high elevations of the Rocky Mountains, but there's these remnant populations in western North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska that just stand as a testament to kind of toughness. And these limber pines, some of those are over 400 or 500 years old. They don't grow very fast at all. And boy, are they remarkable trees. If you're out in this little bit of pocketed forest near Pine Bluffs, you might see the pinyon jay or the Clark's nutcracker late in the summer coming to visit the seed cones of these trees, which have big edible seeds. Let me make sure we got anybody coming in. Okay, one more. Here we are. Welcome to Tree Planting and Care 101. We're getting going here with some fun facts about trees. This is another really cool thing about trees is the quaking aspen, which we often think of as a single tree, but they grow in these great big colonies. And if you plant one in your yard, just be aware that you are planting what's going to be a colony of trees at some point. This colony of quaking aspen in Utah is called Pando. It's estimated to be over 80,000 years old. How did they figure that out? I don't know, but that's just fascinating to me. 6,600 tons of weight, but over 40,000 trunks. That is one single living organism that has spread itself out over 80,000 years over several acres. It's just fascinating. Here's one closer to home. The pawpaw is the largest native edible tree with fruit in North America. Believe it or not, it reaches its western limit right here in southeast Nebraska. It's a host plant for the zebra swallowtail butterfly. Look at this pawpaw in the picture on the left. That's at just a nondescript house in Havelock in Lincoln, Nebraska. And those trees have been there for 35 years now. It'll hang on and be a pretty darn tough tree if you just give it a chance. And those custard-like fruits that ripen in September, early October are fun to eat. Even in the spring, when you get these magenta-colored flowers, eggplant-colored flowers, bell-shaped flowers are pretty attractive, and they attract these zebra swallowtails. That's our pawpaw. Here's a fun tree, a common tree, the American linden. It's called basswood sometimes, and that word basswood is actually kind of a mispronunciation of bast wood. Bast is in reference to the tough inner bark or the phloem of a tree, which was called bast. So bast wood has a lot of that fibrous phloem within its inner bark, and that was woven by Native Americans and early settlers to make ropes and mats. So that's really where the name basswood comes from, not from the fish, but from the fibers in its bark. How about Kentucky coffee tree? It has the longest leaf of any native deciduous tree in North America, especially eastern Nebraska. It reaches up to 30 inches long, those leaves do. When those leaves drop, the tree appears to be kind of naked, and that's where the scientific name gymnocladus comes from. That means naked branch. And then the second part of that tree, name for that tree, dioicus, That comes from the word dioecious. That refers to plants that have separate male and female individuals, which is important to know about coffee tree. It's either a male or a female tree. A lot of people curse the female trees for dropping the seeds, but if they didn't have those seeds, we wouldn't have this fun story about coffee trees. They are an evolutionary anachronism when you think about it. The megafauna species that evolved to eat those fruit went extinct 20 to 30,000 years ago. Those animals are all gone, but the trees are still here. And they tell a story of a tree's persistence because the trees, the fauna that were spreading those seeds were gone 30,000 years ago, and the trees started to disappear from North America, hanging on in just a few small pockets here and there. Well, now humans have come along. We figured out how to use this tree in our landscape. It's an absolutely fantastic and beautiful tree once it gets some age on it. And we can even roast those seeds to make a coffee-like drink. So now the coffee tree is spreading itself around again in North America because of we humans, the next megafauna, I suppose, that came along. Chestnut trees are fun to think about. In the eastern U.S., before being wiped out by blight disease in the early 1900s, the American chestnut was probably about a quarter of all trees in the hardwood forest. Can you imagine that? And they were huge, uh, 40 feet around, some of them, 150 feet tall. And they littered the ground with their nuts in the late fall and winter and fed all kinds of wildlife, including bear and deer and all those other things. And now most of those trees are gone, although they're being reintroduced with pretty good genetic work to find disease-resistant varieties. Let's finish up these fun facts with the American hornbeam. This is sometimes called musclewood, or in eastern U.S., like in the Smoky Mountain areas, they call it blue beech because of its smooth bark. It's somewhat similar to a beech with a smooth bark. And I just like that name hornbeam. Where did that come from? Because it takes a horn, that wood is so dense and hard, it'll take a horn-like polish and has been used often to make bowls, canes, tools, and other things by carvers. It was also used, believe it or not, as the beam of wood that separated ox bows. So that horn beam is where that originates from. Also known as musclewood because of this sinewy bark. It looks like somebody's flexing their arms, uh, the bark itself. That's pretty darn cool. I'm going to move along here. Those were just a few fun facts to have fun with trees as we head into the new year. But now let's do a quick little study on tree ID, focusing on winter ID. I'm going to admit another person here. I teach tree ID classes. We're going to teach winter tree ID to the Nebraska arborists later in February. And you have to be aware that our tree ID classes are usually at least 1 day long or over 2 days even to try and get it drummed into people's heads. So what we can do here in a half an hour isn't a whole lot, but let's dive into this and have fun with just a quick look at some of the key attributes to help you identify trees in winter. And these would be what I would say are the key attributes you're going to look for in winter tree ID. First of all, is it an evergreen or a deciduous tree? That's a kind of a duh. But right away, if you can say, oh, that thing's got green needles in the winter, that helps me a lot in trying to figure out what it is. What is the plant's habit, its size, and its form? After you get used to looking at these trees for a while, you'll start to pick the trees out in winter just from their kind of their shape and form, even from a distance. What about that bark, its texture, patterns, and colors? They really shine. Winter is the best time to see the bark of our trees and to start trying to identify them by bark. Then there's a branching pattern, especially is it opposite or alternate in its buds and branching. We can also look at the bud size, their configuration, scales, and color. I don't do a lot of that, but the little bit I do use it on is in the winter. Leaf scars, believe it or not, are helpful. Then leaf and fruit persistence, we call that marcescence. That's part of winter tree ID. How are the twigs configured, excuse me? What's their shape? What do the lenticels look like? Those are the little openings, the dots on the twigs or the bark of a tree. And then also think about where are you seeing that tree in the landscape? That's going to give you all the clues to what that tree is to identify. One place to start, if you can do this, I found these two publications really helpful when I tried to figure out winter tree ID. They're both online, and one is the Pocket Reference for Winter Tree ID by the Champaign County Forest Preserve. That's from Illinois, a great little pocket guide that you can print off or just have on your phone. And then on the right is the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources Winter Tree ID key. That doesn't use photos, but it uses line drawings and really narrows it down to the kinds of trees that we've run across most commonly here in the Midwest. So let's dive into this. Let's look at a few trees and just some of the cool characteristics that we can talk about. We're going to hone in quickly here on evergreen trees, evergreen conifers. We're not going to worry about broadleaf evergreens here, but these are the things that are pine, spruce, fir, juniper, and maybe arborvitae. In the winter, these are the things that really stand out because they're green all winter, right? Well, let's start with our pine trees. I've been doing a series of looks at um, the evergreen trees that we have in our part of the world. And we started with pine trees, and there are two broad groups of pines. We call them the hard pines or the soft pines. This can help you quite a bit with tree ID because hard pines, sometimes called yellow pines, have stiff round needles in bundles of twos and threes, typically, whereas the soft pines or the white pines have soft, droopy needles, typically in groups of five. There's one oddball out for you guys out in western Nebraska, the pinyon pine, which has stiff, short needles and usually just one or two needles. That's a western Nebraska species, and that is actually in the white pine group. But we won't use it to confuse ourselves today. For most of Nebraska, pinyon pine is not a common tree grown, but it should be used more in western Nebraska. So let's look at a couple of these hard pines, these yellow pines. The two most common you'll find in the landscape of Nebraska are Austrian pine and ponderosa pine. And they can look very similar to each other from a little bit of a distance. And so what you're going to say, how am I going to tell those two apart? Well, these are just the quick key attributes. Start by looking at the bark. The bark of an Austrian pine is silver and black. So there's lines of both silver and black in that bark, whereas the bark of a ponderosa pine is really kind of more pretty cinnamon red brown, interlaced with black lines. Then there's needles. The needles are only in pairs on the Austrian pine, and they're a little bit shorter, maybe 4 to 5 inches long. The ponderosa pine has needles in both twos and threes, and they're usually 6 to 8 inches long. And then finally, the pine cones. If you can find a pine cone underneath a tree, I use that a lot for tree ID, especially Austrian pine and ponderosa pine, because the ponderosa pine here on the lower right has this really sharp prickle at the end of the cone scale. That's the scale, the part that opens up on the side of the cone. And they have a sharp needle-like prickle on them, which will say, yep, that's ponderosa pine. The other most commonly encountered hard pine in eastern Nebraska across much of the state for the longest time has been the Scotch pine or the Scots pine. It is now dying off in great numbers because of pine wilt disease, so we don't see as many as we used to, but there are still a lot of them out there. And for tree ID, the simplest one to hone in on is that cinnamon orange, peely, well, mostly orange, kind of a bright orange bark that really peels off, especially on young branches. Take a look at a Scotch pine, anything with that orange red color, that vivid in the winter for us is probably a Scots pine. There are a few other hard pines. We won't spend a lot of time on this here, but one of the most attractive is here on the right. That's called the lace bark pine from China, and you can definitely see why it gets its name lace bark. They're a lacy type of a bark even from an early age, so you'll pick those out in the landscape pretty easily. And then another tree you might encounter is this picture on the lower left, the jack pine, which is native to the northeast U.S., the cold parts of Canada, the northeast U.S. And it has these interesting curved cones that will hug the branches on that tree for many years. Oftentimes in nature, they won't open up until there's a fire that roars through. But they here in Nebraska, it would probably take 4 or 5 years for those cones to open up and fall off the tree. Let's move into our white pines. And the first one to talk about is a pretty common tree here in eastern Nebraska. That's the eastern white pine, Pinus strobus. It has needles in groups of 5, pretty long needles, 3 to 4 inches, soft and flexible. And it's a tall, fast-growing tree. Of the pine trees in eastern Nebraska, it's the one that grows the biggest. It does not like our heat and drought. This is a Northeast U.S. native that prefers cooler days, cooler nights, and consistent moisture. So it's a little hard for it to be out here on the plains. But we have big old nice eastern white pines around. And one good ID feature is it's a long cone, about 6 inches long, and pretty light, not as woody as the other tree cones, almost papery like and light in weight. So that's the eastern white pine. There are a few other white pines, and one that we can really be proud of that we use in Nebraska is the limber pine, which I mentioned earlier is one of those old trees from western Nebraska. This is a limber pine on the left in the Kimball City Park. Uh, Compared to the eastern white pine, the limber pine and its cousin on the right, the southwestern white pine, are closely related, and they generally have 2 to 3 inch more blue-green needles and a much more woody and robust cone, and they don't get nearly as big as the eastern white pine. There are quite a few nice specimens of both southwestern white pine and the limber pine across Nebraska. And one of the great places to find these trees, if you're looking to track them down, I stole this picture from Faller Landscape in York on the right. And I think Todd has recommended both trees in the right situation for planting in Nebraska. So thank you for that picture. All right, moving out of pines. Again, we could spend all day on many other pines. We just don't have the time for that. But let's look at spruce, fir, and Douglas fir. These trees all look very similar to each other from a distance, kind of that classic Christmas tree shape, that upright triangular shape. Well, here's the quick summary of their differences. A spruce tree's needles are stiff, sharp, stalked, and square, and they're spirally arranged on that stem. Another thing to think about with spruce is the cones, the seed cones, point downward and fall off the tree intact. Fir trees can look a lot like a spruce tree too, but they have soft or blunted needles, which are flat and flexible. They're also stalkless, and they come out horizontally on the twigs of the branches on a fir tree. And for concolor fir on the lower right that you can see, they come out laterally, but they sweep upwards, and they can be pretty long, 2 to 3 inches long, even on a concolor fir. The other thing about fir trees to keep in mind, you will not find cones underneath a fir tree because the cones point upward at the top of the canopy of the tree, and they disintegrate when they're ripe. They come apart in the wind and the movement of the tree, and they don't land on the ground intact. And then finally, on the Douglas fir, the last tree we'll talk about, they do have soft and flat needles like a fir tree, but they have cones that point downward, somewhat similar to a spruce tree, and they do fall from the tree intact. So it's not a true fir and it's not a spruce. It kind of straddles the line in between them. Here's our 3 most common spruce trees that you'll find in Nebraska. On the left, Colorado spruce, sometimes called blue spruce. Be aware that there's great variability in the color of a Colorado spruce. Some can be vividly bright blue, like this picture where the cone on the upper right. Some are more green. It just depends on the genetics of that tree and also its age. Young trees can generally be a little bit more bluish in color than others. And there are some fun cultivars on the market that stay bright blue, like Hoopsie blue spruce or Skinny Jeans blue spruce, things like that. In the middle is Black Hill spruce. Let's look at Latin names here just quickly. The Colorado spruce is called Picea pungens. Pungens means sharp, pointed, and that's in reference to the Colorado spruce being quite the prickly animal with its sharp cones. If you run into that blue spruce, you are going to feel it. They are sharp. The Black Hill spruce in the middle, which is a form of white spruce, Picea glauca, and glauca means white or whitish or silver, and that's in reference to the underside of its needles, which are shorter and not nearly as prickly as the Colorado spruce. The differences in the cones is also going to give these two trees apart. The Colorado spruce on the left has about a 3 to 4 inch cone, and the little cone on the Black Hill spruce is only 1 to 1.5 inches long or so. And then finally, in eastern Nebraska on the right, we see quite a bit of Norway spruce. It is one of the biggest and fastest growing evergreens we have. It can easily reach over 90 feet tall and be 50 to 60 feet wide in time. You'll know a Norway spruce because of its branches are pendulous. They curve outwards and curve back upwards. And then at the branch tips, the branchlets hang off. They're pendulous. They're hanging down at the end of those branches very distinctively. And then the Norway spruce is also known for having the biggest cone of all the spruces, often 5 to 6 inches long. Moving out of the spruces into the firs, we're only going to look at one fir, although there are several that can grow in Nebraska. This by far is the most common one, and that's concolor fir, Abies concolor. And you'll know it's a fir when you come up and grab it, and the needles are soft and flexible, flat and swept upwards. These are long needles on the concolor fir. Bright blue color quite often on the concolor fir. Concolor means one color, and the needles are the same color, both sides of the needle. So it gives this bright silvery blue color to most young concolor firs. They're absolutely fantastic trees. And in some ways, they're actually starting to maybe outdo Colorado spruce in eastern Nebraska for survivability against our warming climate. We love concolor fir and we should plant more of them. Let's look at Douglas fir real quickly. It's that odd duck in between firs and spruce. And there are a lot of nice Douglas firs around Nebraska. If you ever get a chance to be in Gordon, go visit the cemetery out southwest of town, and you'll be amazed at all the evergreens out there, including the big old Douglas firs that just really envelop that cemetery with some really cool. It feels like you're in the mountains again when you're outside of Gordon. Soft flat needles with short stalks, two silvery bands on the underside, and then the cone is very distinctive of the Douglas fir. It points downward on the branches, comes off the tree intact, and it has these little bracts that sneak out between the scales. And to me, they look like either a snake tongue, or I've had somebody describe it to me like a mouse's foot sneaking out from between those scales of that cone. That's Douglas fir. Be aware that Douglas fir has a thinning canopy as it matures. It may not be the tree you want when it's 60 to 70 years old, because that canopy will be much thinner than some of our spruce trees, but still a wonderful tree that we can plant more of. If we're in Nebraska, our two most common native trees, actually outside of ponderosa pine, are going to be Rocky Mountain juniper and eastern red cedar. Here in eastern Nebraska, the eastern red cedar is the only native evergreen. So sometimes we curse it for its runaway nature in our pastures and wildlands, but it's our only native evergreen and is quite beneficial for wildlife. And it is a absolutely fantastic and lovely tree when it matures in the landscape. I love the reddish color, red orange bark that becomes peeling off in papery strips as it matures. And if you scrape that bark, you'll get that classic cedar smell on a cedar tree. If you have a couple near your house, your yard just always smells like a cedar closet, which is a good thing in my opinion. The two trees are pretty similar to each other. If you were in western Nebraska, Rocky Mountain juniper is the tree of choice. It's more blue in color, blue-green in the fall and winter, whereas eastern red cedar here in the east is more of a dull green to a red or purple color in the winter. One reason why it gets its name red cedar, its bark and its leaves in the winter. Then we have one more evergreen to think about. We see quite a bit of this used in windbreaks and especially backyards here in suburban areas of eastern Nebraska, and that's the eastern arborvitae, Thuya occidentalis. The arborvitaes are known because they have these vertical fan-shaped branchlets of leaves. The needles are not nearly as pokey as red cedar, and they come in these sprays of vertical fans of needles. That's the best way I can describe it. You'll see a lot of these in yards and maybe I wouldn't call them shelter belts, but screenings against properties in eastern Nebraska. One last tree we'll look at here in this group is the bald cypress. It's a deciduous conifer, so not an evergreen. But if you have a conifer that looks like it died all of a sudden in the winter, but it has a bark that looks like cedar with those papery, peely strips of orange and red, buttressed roots, and maybe these seed balls hanging off, chances are that's a bald cypress that dropped its needles naturally last fall. The bald cypress is another great tree for eastern Nebraska. Loves a wet spot, but is amazingly drought tolerant once you get it established. Okay, we got to move this along a little bit. We're going to look at deciduous trees. We don't have a lot of time to do this, so we're just going to touch on some of the fun characteristics of trees that just signal that tree from that tree a little bit, and especially that shine in the winter. First thing I'll say about deciduous tree ID, always remember MADBUC, maple ash, dogwoods, and buckeyes. That acronym, MADBUC, that'll tell you the trees that typically have opposite branching and buds are the maples, the ash, dogwoods, and buckeyes. Just be aware that lilacs and viburnums are also in that opposite bud set group. Most other trees are then alternate, and I use this key all the time to identify trees throughout the year, opposite or alternate branching. And then there's one tree that's an oddball. That's the catalpa. If you ever look at the buds of a catalpa, they are whorled. There's three buds that come out almost at the same spot around the twig itself. So that's called whorled, and that's what a catalpa does. Okay, remember MADBUC, opposite buds and opposite branching. We can even use that in winter. Green ash here in the middle is opposite buds, opposite branching. And then on the right, that's an Ohio buckeye. And believe it or not, those buds don't look like they're opposite, but they are actually coming off opposite. One bud is more dominant at the end of that twig. And then in winter tree ID, after you start doing it a while, you're going to see from a distance that some trees are just, you can pick them out by their coarse texture. Things like coffee tree, walnut, hickories, catalpa. Those trees have big leaves, big compound leaves or simple leaves that fall off in great numbers in the fall, and they leave that tree to be kind of naked, coffee tree especially, but walnut is pretty easy to pick out in the winter just because it's a coarse habit. Whereas fine textured trees have smaller leaves, and even in the winter, they look more fine textured, like elms, lindens, hackberries, birch, crab apples, and some maples. And let me show right away this picture on the right that I'm circling. I hope you can see that. This is a tree that you can start to identify pretty quickly. It's one of the most common trees planted in our landscapes, and you'll see it in probably 1 out of every 3 yards now. And that's an autumn blaze maple with this upright branching, a lot of branching going on that you don't know how to fix, a lot of tight crotch angles. Almost always that's an autumn blaze maple in the landscape, although forms of pear tree will do that too. Autumn blaze maple. I love the winter to look at bark. And boy, this is the time of year when bark shines. And look at these emphasis of rough bark. Black walnut on the left, when the sun is low in the sky late in the day, shining on the bark of a walnut, you will see how it's a kind of a reddish brown bark and deeply furrowed. And you start to pick those out after a time from the landscape. Same with hackberry. Hackberry in the middle has a wartiness to it and also a stucco-like nature to it. So warts and stucco on the bark of a hackberry. And then on the right, if you ever run into a mature persimmon, you're going to think you ran into an alligator's back. That's what it looks like there on the side of a persimmon. Here's Kentucky coffee tree. Look at that bark glowing in the late day sun. And another tree, kind of like hackberry, that it looks like that bark was stuccoed onto the side of the tree as it matures. I wanted to show you on the right another ID characteristic for Kentucky coffee tree, believe it or not, is they can come up in patches. They are a colony forming tree, and left to their own devices in the woods, they will send up root sprouts and you from the mother tree, and so you'll end up with a patch of coffee trees usually near each other. And this on the right is a picture of a patch of coffee trees coming up from the parent trees in the background in the park in Waverly. Cottonwood on the left, if you think about bark and coarse nature of bark, cottonwood is probably our most deeply furrowed native bark. It is, when it gets old, it is deeply furrowed. My joke is you can often lose a cat or a small child in the crevices of cottonwood bark. That's how deeply furrowed it is. Compare that on the right to another wonderful native tree whose bark, shape, color, and form just shines in the winter, and that's the bur oak. Big, bold, branching structure, deeply furrowed bark, very dark gray and into a dark brown color in the winter. I love the look of a bur oak all year long, but even in the winter, they are fantastic. Smooth bark. When you get trees with this really smooth bark here in Nebraska, it helps a lot because we don't have a lot of these, but they are pretty easy to ID, or they helps you to ID because there aren't a lot of them. Yellowwood on the left, the beech tree in the middle, and hornbeam or carpinus on the right. Musclewood, sometimes it's called. I would also throw in magnolia as one of these trees, also zelkova that can have smooth bark. So outside of those 5 species, if it's this smooth, it's got to be one of those 5 trees probably for us. Mottled bark, sycamore just shines in the winter. Look at that tree on the left. Sometimes they're ghostly white when they mature, but when they're younger, they have vestiges of that white, gray, brown, and tan peeling off in all these mottled beauty. In the middle is a tree with a similar way of its mottling of its bark, and that's the lacebark pine we already talked about. And then on the right, we don't have a lot of these trees, but lacebark elm. When you see a lacebark elm, especially in the winter when the sun is low, I just love the look of a lacebark elm. That's not a native tree, but boy, is it a tree that's tough, drought tolerant, and heat tolerant. There are trees with some of this cool peeling and papery bark. The one we probably noticed the most is on the left, that's river birch. In the middle is paper birch. We have less of because it's not as adaptable to our climate as the river birch. And then on the right, shagbark hickory. If you're in our native woods in eastern Nebraska and you run into trees with these long strips of their bark peeling off, chances are that's our shagbark hickory. More peeling bark, paperbark maple on the left, black cherry in the middle, and then believe it or not, Amermachia on the right. When you get a tree, an Amermachia that's a little older, the other thing you'll notice about Amermachia, not only is the bark peeling, it has an orangeness to it, kind of an orange-green mix in the bark of that Amermachia. Another tree that does that for us is our native box elder tree. And then here are 2 trees with peeling bark, especially as they mature. The silver maple on the left, and then the honey locust on the right. And of course, a native honey locust that grew from seed might be festooned with all these darn thorns. And boy, with that, you'll sure know what that is when you run into it if it's a honey locust. But they both have these peeling strips of bark as they mature. Maple trees confuse us quite often, and so we'll just take a quick look at winter ID for maple, starting with the bark. These are our 4 most common maple trees in the landscape. Sugar maple on the left. To me, as it matures, it starts to become kind of a sooty gray color with peeling strips. Red maple is more of a light gray to almost whitish when young, and it doesn't get the peeling strips like the sugar maple does. We just talked about silver maple, and then on the right is Norway maple. If you just looked at that bark and said, what is it? In my mind, that could either be Norway maple or green ash, and we'll look at green ash. So Norway maple is kind of an oddball in terms of the bark. And then quickly looking at the buds of maple trees, if you want to figure out maples in the winter, the 4 big trees we have in our landscapes. On the left is the sugar maple with a sharp pointed bud. The red maple on the left, especially with those flower buds, are small, round, red buds. On the right, or excuse me, the next tree is silver maple with the flower buds starting to open up in late winter. They have buds very similar to a red maple, but it's going to be a much different tree throughout, not quite as red a color in the stem. And then Norway maple on the right is the other oddball. It is opposite branching, opposite buds, but it has bright purple red, fat, round buds compared to the other maples. Now let's just look at some of these interesting odd things that different trees have. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll have time at the end here to think about it a little harder. But here's some fun facts about trees for ID. Bitternut hickory on the left, sulfur yellow buds. That's a native Nebraska tree that we should use more in our planted landscapes. The black walnut is the next twig. The black walnut, when I see that bud, that winter bud, it looks to me like a monkey's face looking at me, and it's fuzzy like a monkey's face. The cottonwood has these big pointed buds that are waxy in their coating. That's called propyphil or proposil, and that's a pretty good winter treat. They point upwards. Sometimes we call that ad pressed when they're pointing upwards on the twig, and the cottonwood is very unique that way. And then red oak on the right. All of the oak trees have their buds ending at the end of the twig in these groups of usually 4 to 5 buds kind of right out from each other at the tip of the twig. Most oaks do that. Here's Ohio buckeye. It's, remember that mad buck, it has opposite twigs, opposite buds, but it often ends its buds in a single dominant bud with a smaller bud to the side. And these are papery, the scales of the Ohio buckeye are papery as they cover that bud. But look at the horse chestnut, its cousin on the right. Those buds are sticky and resinous. And another ID clue for Ohio buckeye or either of these trees, even in the winter, is look on the ground underneath the tree for these seed remnants. There's often the bumpy outer coating or the outer husk of that seed itself, but you might even find a squirrel rejected buckeye underneath the tree itself in the winter. American beech on the upper left, also the European beech. They have these long, narrow, toothpick-like buds. And boy, nothing else is quite that narrow and long. Serviceberry has long buds, but nothing quite like that. On the right is tulip tree. I see a platypus face or a duckbill on the tip of a tulip tree bud. And then the ginkgo in the bottom of the middle there. The ginkgo has these spurs where the leaves emerge from in tufts or groups of leaves, and they emerge from this single point on the twig every year. And every year, that little spur gets a little bit bigger. So as the tree matures, it can have spurs that are even 3 inches long, 1 to 3 inches long. That's ginkgo. Sycamore. I see an ice cream cone hanging off the side of the twig on a sycamore. Just look at that triangular shaped cone. It looks like an ice cream cone to me. On the upper right, this is ad pressed, the term we use to call these buds that are on the pointing straight upwards and tightly held against the twig. That is hackberry. And hackberry is one of the most ad pressed species out there. It's also two ranked. That American elm on the lower right is also two ranked. Two ranked means that the buds are coming out on opposite planes from each other, not opposite directly from each other, but on opposite planes. They're not swirling around the twig. They're on opposite planes, two ranked. And then on the lower left is American linden, which has a reddish brown color, and then also a very zigzag pattern to the twigs and the buds. Look at our ash trees. Here's some good winter tree ID for ash. All of our ash trees have a terminal bud that looks to me like a Hershey's Kiss. I love chocolate so much, and so a green ash like that, I feel like I'm going to eat the tip of that twig and enjoy some chocolate. That's green ash. Blue ash is the next tree over. That's a rare tree for us, but we have a few around. And the interesting thing about blue ash is it has square stems, but it still has that Hershey Kiss cone on it, or excuse me, bud. These are opposite branched trees. And then in that picture in the middle on the upper right, that's the buds, the side buds of both American ash or white ash on the left and green ash on the right. We talked about leaf scars earlier, and you can use your leaf scars to identify ash trees because a White ash and a green ash can look very similar in the winter landscape, but look at the buds. The white ash buds are smiling at us, whereas the green ash buds are more flat across the top. And then on the right is green ash bark. Both white ash and green ash bark develop this triangular, deeply furrowed pattern as they mature. Look for the triangles and the diamond-shaped pattern in the bark of an ash tree as it matures. Here's some fun ones, boy, twigs and branches. Bur oak. Some bur oaks come with these really weird, corky winged ridges on the small twigs of a young tree. And we're not exactly sure genetically why that happens on some bur oaks and not others, but it's almost certainly a fire adaptation tool for trees that had to survive prairie fires as they evolved. And then on the right is swamp white oak. It has peely, papery bark, even on its youngest branches, and that will definitely give away swamp white oak in the winter. We talked about this term earlier, marcescence, and marcescent means dead parts of a tree that are hanging on through the winter, and that can be leaves, fruits, or seeds, things like that. Marcescence leaf species in the winter includes a lot of oaks like pin oak, swamp white oak, the white oak, the black oak, especially the shingle oak. But then, believe it or not, there are other species that can be quite marcescent, including beech, sugar maple when they're young, ironwood, hornbeam, and some viburnums. That marcescence is a pretty good tool for winter tree ID. Shingle oak on the left and a young swamp white oak on the right. Also, just because it's winter doesn't mean we don't look at fruits and seeds. These seeds really give away these trees, and they're often hanging off the trees in the winter. Coffee tree on the upper left. To its right is going to be sycamore. Actually, we know that that's a plane tree because the seed balls are in pairs, whereas sycamores would be singular. Then the next one is a sweet gum. They're usually littering the ground under a sweet gum tree this time of year. Catalpa on the right often, excuse me, has those good cigar-shaped seeds hanging down through the winter. Linden on the lower left has the small little seeds and the remnants of the flower structures that brought those seeds to bear last winter. They look like leaves, small little leaves hanging off of those seeds. Tulip trees are interesting because those tulip-like flowers turn into tulip-like seeds pointing upwards at the end of the branches throughout the winter. They shatter and come down in winter winds. Box elder then is the next tree on the lower right. That's our Native American maple, the box elder maple, and its seeds are considered to be pretty marcescent. It holds on to its seeds well into winter. Other fruits and seeds that you might run into to help you with ID, crab apples for sure. Most of our crab apples now have persistent winter fruits, and I don't know the cultivars on these, but that to me is a good thing because it's going to bring some hungry birds to your trees, especially late winter and early spring. Think about those cedar waxwings traveling through looking for a snack. And then on the right, black walnut. If you have a black walnut around, the squirrels don't get away with everything. You'll find remnants of those walnuts underneath the tree, especially if they've eaten part of the fruit away last fall. More fruit remnants like acorn remnants, red oak on the upper left, swamp white oak on the upper right. I threw that in because it's one of the few oaks with a long stem with the acorn held off on a long stem. So the cap of that's called a peduncle, that long stem holding that cap on the swamp white oak. Bur oak on the lower left has these caps that are really frilled. And then on the lower right, the pin oak, small little acorns the size of your fingertip, but boy, can they litter the ground underneath those trees throughout the winter. A few winter flower structures to throw at you. Ironwood catkins on the upper left look a lot like birch catkins as well. Cottonwood catkins will start elongating in late winter, and they'll help you pick out a cottonwood tree, in February or March. And then on the middle upper right, those are silver maple buds starting to swell. Even late January in warm weather, but especially February and March, they will swell and pop open with first chance they get, first signs of spring. And then magnolia flower buds on the right are fuzzy throughout the winter. You can tell trees apart a little bit by some of these odd problems that show up. For example, flower galls on white ash, especially autumn purple ash. If you have a tree with the broccoli-like flower galls on it here on the left throughout the winter, that's going to be most likely a variety of white ash. On the upper right is something called bullet gall, which can be common on some types of bur oak and swamp white oak, especially if they're stressed. Those are formed by small wasps that get in there and infect the tree twigs. Usually they don't kill a tree, but they can be very noticeable. People think they're acorns, but they're part of a gall structure. And then on the bottom, you might run into a hackberry, which has these tufts of twigs scattered throughout the canopy, and those are called witch's brooms. And that's very prevalent on certain hackberries. Not every hackberry, but usually you'll know it's a hackberry if you see it that loaded with witch's brooms. As I wrap up, let me just throw a few weeds at you to look for. We want you to be able to ID these trees a little bit just so we can help control them. The common mulberry or the white mulberry is the tree here, first picture. And in the winter, it gives itself away because it has an orange bark. And then it is also probably coming up in a fence line or underneath another tree, anywhere it wasn't invited, coming up on its own. That's the mulberry. And actually, winter, late fall and early winter is a good time to cut those down and treat the stump if you're trying to get rid of them. Another tree that we really hope you pay attention to in terms of trying to get rid of, but which is coming on fast across the Midwest and Eastern Great Plains, is the tree of heaven. It's extremely fast growing, looks weedy in nature. It's often clonal, coming up in these colonies like this picture on the lower left. It can grow 3 or 4 feet in a year. And in the winter, it's kind of a stark and naked tree, looking a lot like, to me, from a distance, like it could be a walnut. But I just threw in here the picture of the walnut bud next to the tree of heaven bud so that you'll see that walnut has that monkey face looking at you and it has a fuzzy twig. The tree of heaven has heart-shaped leaf scars and a very smoothness to it. And then also female trees have these disc-like seeds hanging off in the winter. Not every tree has them because Ailanthus is dioecious, meaning it has both male and female trees. This tree is really starting to become a problem in some of our eastern Nebraska woodlands, and we need to take efforts to eradicate it. And then another tree that is starting to be really problematic is the ornamental pear, the Callery pear. And for winter tree ID, there's 3 things that you'll look at. This tight branch structure where the main stems, there's usually 4 or 5 competing main stems coming out against each other low in the canopy. And almost every pear tree has some of that going on. And then on the upper right, if they developed fruit the previous fall, these little small pear fruits are likely hanging off throughout the winter. And then on the middle picture here on the upper left, the buds of that Callery pear, that ornamental pear, have a shiny, or excuse me, not shiny, a fuzzy whiteness to them. These are alternate buds set on the twig, but that fuzzy whiteness might only be confused with maybe a serviceberry or something like that. But that's, if you looked at the two together, it would not be anything like a serviceberry. Maybe a little bit like a pussy willow or a magnolia, but I don't think you'd confuse it with either of those trees. Please don't plant ornamental pears. And if you get a chance to go help eradicate them in our native woods, go do it. We need to get rid of them in places like our Lincoln Wilderness Park and then our native woodlands in eastern Nebraska where they're coming on strong. Okay, that was it. You survived Winter Tree ID in 1 hour. And let me just point out to you as we wrap up here, the next Tree Care 101 webinar will be coming back in March 13. Graham Herbst will be here to talk about good pruning and bad practices. April 10th, we'll do proper tree planting in honor of Arbor Day, and we'll really try to dive in this year on how to do that right. And then May 8th, invasive species. Brad Kindler is going to do a deeper dive on some of the issues we just talked about related to things like Callery pear, tree of heaven, and honeysuckle. And then the reason we're taking February off with these presentations is that Plant Nebraska has a great lineup of what they call plant talks happening this month and next, January 15th through March 5th. Look at that lineup of great plant talks that you can sign up for that are free and over the noon hour on the Thursdays of these weeks. So January 15th, 22nd, the 5th, 12th, 19th, 26th of February, and then March 5th. And even let's see, Brad and I will be back on with herbicide injury on March 5th. What a lot of great topics. And with that, I'm going to stop the screen share and say congratulations to you all for getting through that. If you have any questions, chime in. And also now is the time, if you are a certified arborist, please put your name and certification number in the chat box, and I will make sure they get to the right place. This webinar is being recorded, and I'll have the uh, chat summary at the end of it. We do have a question here. In winter, how to tell the difference between American elm and red elm. Oh my God, who asked that? Will, well, that was you. Thanks a lot, buddy. Uh, you go get a real expert like Guy Sternberg or something to go hiking with you, and then you'll know how to tell them apart. I don't know, Will. You can cut into the bark, and maybe you can enlighten us, Will. You can cut into the bark. The bark of the red elm is very bright red in color. It's also called slippery elm, and it has this gelatinous feel to it. And I've seen people do that, and you can definitely see the difference between American elm and red elm. If you do have leaves on the ground handy, that red elm has the upper surface of it has a almost sandpaper feel to it, and it will stick to your hand when you push them together, unlike the American elm. Otherwise, those leaves are kind of look a lot alike each other. Do you have some out your way that you confuse you? Yeah. Do you have anything you want to say? Do I have to unmute you? Let's see if I can do that here. I will say,
Yes, you've seen our 1883 American elm,
yes,
and I've sent seed over the last 10 or 15 years to buy.
right.
But we also have a red elm, at least it's identified. It was before I was working as a volunteer in the Arboretum, and it's huge also, but I really can't tell the difference. But I think
Yes,
the roughness of the red elm leaf might help me.
it helps.
In the winter,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
probably a lost cause in the winter. You might try to bark peel just a little bit of a small part just to give it a good, carefully, so you don't hurt the tree too much. But can you reach a smaller branch?
no,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
huge.
Okay. Let's try to ID that out at some point. I remember we had Guy Sternberg here who showed me the difference one time, and I thought I knew it, but I couldn't do it anymore.
Thank you.
Thank you, Will, for chiming in. Thank you all for attending today, too. This was outstanding. If you've got any questions, please chime in. I don't know if you guys can unmute yourselves this time or not. If you can't, I'll unmute you and you can ask a question. Otherwise, put it in the chat. Do we have any more questions? I don't see any. We'll leave this open for just a couple more minutes so people can put in their um, certification information. Thank you all for attending, and we'll be back in March. Plan to tune in on those plant talks, those statewide arboretum plant talks later in the month and in February. Oh, is it possible? Good question, Diane. IDing apple trees to determine variety. And I don't know if Brad Kindler is still on here. Brad, are you paying attention? He's my cohort who really knows. Let's see.
Yeah, I'm paying attention, Justin. I'll put a link up here to a place where you can send in tissue samples. That's really the only way. Other than that, is you got to eat the apple in the fall and figure out which variety it is.
Can
Yeah.
you tell them apart a little bit by branching structure once you're familiar with them, or?
No, not in my experience. I mean,
Okay.
especially if it's just a regular eating apple. Yeah, you're really gonna have to tell it apart just by the color of the apple, the taste of the apple. But there is a way to get a tissue sample and ID it that way also.
And when you're IDing by fruit, are there some that are confusing or close to each other, or usually tell them apart pretty well?
Sure, I think the first thing you want to think about is when is it ripening? And then obviously its color as well. Those are characteristics that help you kind of create some distinction between the variety of apple. So if it's an early summer apple, you know that it's not going to be something, right, that would be ripening in late September, right? So there's a way in with which you can start to kind of figure out what variety it is based off of those characteristics.
Okay. I'm going to put in the chat here the information on the Illinois Pocket Reference Guide for Winter Tree ID, Champaign County Forest Preserve Pocket Reference for Winter Tree ID. And then somebody asked the question, they joined late, where will I find the recording? Great question. The easiest thing to say here, I wish I had a link directly for you, but go to the Nebraska Forest Service YouTube page, and you might have to do a little poking around there, but these are identified as a series of trees under tree planting and care 101. And if you're ever interested, we will do both winter tree ID here later in February. Send me a personal note and I can get you into that class. We've done it before for the Ollie class here on campus. And then in the fall, late summer and fall, we also teach summer tree ID for those that might be interested. If you're interested in building your tree ID skills, let me know. Just send me a personal message, jevertson1@unl.edu, and I'll send you some links to how you might go about that. Thanks, Brad, for that information on fruit trees. We need to do more with fruit trees. All right, has everybody submitted their CEU information? If so, I'm going to shut her down and go to the restroom because my bladder is pounding me. It was really good to see everybody. Happy New Year. Keep plugging along. Let's hope we get some snow. But if we not, let's hope we get some more rain. Oh, that's pretty good. The third. Thank you.